For 5 years, he kept everyone at a distance, ruling his pack with absolute coldness after losing everything he loved. Then she stumbled, wounded, into his territory, carrying secrets that could destroy his leadership. What he did not expect was that protecting her would mean breaking the most important promise he had made to himself. Blood trickled down Serena's torn palm as she pressed it against the ancient oak, her breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed through the moonlit forest. 5 days of running had brought her to this moment, to this place where the scent of pine and something infinitely more dangerous hung heavy in the air. She could feel eyes watching her from the shadows, predatory and calculating, but exhaustion had stripped away her ability to care about anything beyond the next step forward. The backpack hanging from her shoulder had been shredded by thorns hours ago, its contents scattered across miles of unforgiving terrain. All that remained were the clothes on her back, a water bottle with perhaps 2 sips left, and the secret that had driven her to flee civilization entirely. Her military training whispered warnings about entering unknown territory, but desperation had a way of silencing even the most ingrained survival instincts. She stumbled forward, her boots squelching in the damp earth, when a low growl froze the blood in her veins. Not 20 feet away, yellow eyes reflected the moonlight, and Serena realized with crystalline clarity that her flight had brought her directly into the domain of creatures she had only heard about in whispered stories around military campfires. "You're trespassing," came a voice from the darkness, deep and commanding in a way that made her spine straighten involuntarily. "Turn around and leave. This is your only warning." Serena lifted her chin, meeting those golden eyes even as her knees threatened to buckle. "I can't go back." The admission hung between them like a challenge, and she watched as a massive figure emerged from between the trees. Even in the uncertain light, she could see he was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught silver highlights from the moon above. His presence filled the space around them, making the very air seem to vibrate with barely contained power. "Everyone can go back," he said, his tone flat and unforgiving. "The question is whether they survive the return journey. Not me." The words escaped before she could stop them, carrying more vulnerability than she intended. "There's nothing left to go back to." For a heartbeat, something flickered across his features, too quick to identify. Then his expression hardened again, carved from stone and winter moonlight. "This territory belongs to the Shadowmere Pack. Humans who wander into our lands rarely leave them." The threat should have terrified her. Instead, Serena felt only a strange sense of relief. After days of running from human monsters, facing a supernatural predator felt almost honest by comparison. "Then I suppose this is where my story ends." She let her backpack fall to the ground and sank down beside it, too exhausted to maintain the pretense of strength any longer. Her body ached in ways she hadn't experienced since her most brutal training exercises, and something deep in her chest felt broken beyond repair. If death found her here, at least it would be clean and quick, not the slow destruction that awaited her in the world she had fled. The man stepped closer, and she could see the confusion in his golden eyes. Clearly, her reaction wasn't what he had expected. "What are you running from?" "Myself," she whispered, then let out a laugh that held no humor. "And everyone who made me into something I never wanted to become." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn clothing, her obvious exhaustion, the way her hands shook despite her efforts to appear composed. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its hard edge. "What's your name?" "Serena." She looked up at him, noting the sharp angles of his face, the way he held himself like violence was always just beneath the surface. "Are you going to kill me now? Or should I wait for the rest of your pack?" "I am the rest of my pack," he said, and there was something almost bitter in the admission. Damien Blackwood, Alpha of Shadowmere. The name suited him, she thought distantly. Dark and unforgiving, like the mountains that surrounded them. "Well, Damien Blackwood, Alpha of Shadowmere, I hope you'll make it quick. I'm tired of running." Instead of the violence she expected, he crouched down until they were at eye level. This close, she could see the intelligence in his gaze, the careful way he assessed her as both threat and puzzle. "When did you last eat?" The question caught her off guard. 3 days ago, maybe 4. Time has become somewhat negotiable. He was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if he was debating the most efficient way to dispose of her body. Then he stood, extending his hand toward her. "Come with me." Serena stared at the offered hand as if it might be a trap. In her experience, kindness from strangers usually came with hidden costs. "Why?" "Because whatever you're running from has hurt you enough," he said simply. "And despite what humans believe about my kind, we don't murder exhausted women who pose no threat to our territory." She wanted to argue that she did pose a threat, that her very presence could bring destruction down on anyone foolish enough to help her. But the words died in her throat as she looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected to find in a supernatural predator. Genuine concern. Against every instinct screaming at her to remain cautious, Serena placed her hand in his. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her system, as if her body recognized something her mind couldn't yet process. His skin was warm, almost fevered, and when his fingers closed around hers, she felt steadier than she had in weeks. He pulled her to her feet with careful strength, and she realized he was even taller than she had initially thought. Standing this close, she caught his scent, pine and leather with something wild underneath that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. "My cabin is a 1/4 mile north," he said, releasing her hand but staying close enough to catch her if she stumbled. "You'll be safe there until you recover enough to make better decisions about your future." "And if I decide my future involves staying?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. His golden eyes hardened again, though she thought she detected a flicker of something else beneath the surface. "No human stays in Shadowmere territory. It's not negotiable." "Everything is negotiable," she replied, falling into step beside him despite her exhaustion. "You just have to find the right currency." They walked in silence through the ancient forest, following a path that seemed to exist more in his memory than in any visible markers. Serena found herself studying his profile in the shifting moonlight, noting the way he moved with predatory grace, how his attention constantly shifted to monitor their surroundings. He was a creature built for violence, yet he had shown her more genuine kindness in the past 10 minutes than she had received from her own commanding officers in the final months of her military service. The cabin that emerged from the tree line was larger than she had expected, built from logs that looked old enough to predate modern civilization. Warm light spilled from the windows and smoke curled from the chimney, painting a picture of comfortable domesticity that seemed at odds with the dangerous man beside her. "You live alone?" she asked as they approached the front door. Something passed across his features, too quick to interpret. "Now I do." The simple statement carried weight that made her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. Loss, she recognized, because it was written across her own soul in indelible ink. Whatever had shaped Damian Blackwood into the guarded alpha standing beside her, it had involved saying goodbye to someone who mattered. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter first, a courtesy that spoke of ingrained manners despite his supernatural nature. The interior of the cabin was warm and masculine, decorated with heavy furniture and hunting trophies that somehow managed to feel welcoming rather than threatening. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with books and weapons in equal measure. "Sit," he commanded, indicating a leather chair positioned near the fireplace. "You look ready to collapse." Serena wanted to argue, but her legs chose that moment to remind her just how close to her limits she truly was. She sank into the chair with a grateful sigh, feeling warmth seep into her bones for the first time in days. Damien disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen, and she could hear him moving around with efficient purpose. The domesticity of the sounds seemed surreal, after everything that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been Captain Serena Hayes, decorated soldier and leader of men. Now she was a fugitive, warming herself by a supernatural predator's fireplace, and somehow this felt more like home than anywhere she had been in years. He returned, carrying a steaming mug and a plate loaded with what appeared to be venison stew and thick bread. The scent made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. "Eat slowly," he advised, setting the food on a small table within her reach. "Your body needs time to readjust." She wanted to devour the meal like the starving creature she was, but something in his tone made her heed the warning. The first bite was a revelation, rich and perfectly seasoned, clearly made by someone who understood both cooking and caring for others. "This is incredible. My daughter's recipe," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "She insists that anyone who enters our home should be properly fed, regardless of the circumstances that brought them here." "Your daughter?" Serena paused with the spoon halfway to her mouth, trying to reconcile the image of the dangerous alpha with that of a concerned father. "Eleanor. She's 16 and has more opinions about pack hospitality than someone her age should possess." There was genuine affection in his voice, though it was tempered with something that might have been worry. "She's away visiting her aunt in the Eastern Territories, or you would have already been subjected to an interrogation about your life story and personal preferences regarding various tea blends." Despite everything, Serena found herself smiling. "She sounds formidable." "She is her mother's daughter," he said quietly, and the weight of loss settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Serena set down her spoon, recognizing the particular quality of grief in his voice. "How long ago?" 5 years. He stared into the fire, his golden eyes reflecting the flames. "Cancer. Fought it for 2 years before it finally won." "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but she meant them sincerely. Loss was a language she spoke fluently, even if the circumstances of her own grief were vastly different. "She made me promise to take care of Elena, to keep the pack strong, to never let my guard down again." His voice was carefully neutral, but Serena caught the underlying pain. "I've honored 2 out of 3 commitments. And the third?" He looked directly at her, and she saw something raw and carefully buried in his gaze. "Letting my guard down tends to get people killed. I learned that lesson too well to forget it now." The message was clear. Whatever kindness he was showing her now came with boundaries that would not be crossed. She should have felt warned off, should have understood that her temporary sanctuary came with an expiration date. Instead, she found herself wondering what it would take to reach the man behind all that careful control. "What about you?" he asked, clearly eager to shift the focus away from his own vulnerabilities. "What kind of running brings someone to my forest in the middle of the night?" Serena took another careful bite, buying herself time to decide how much truth she was prepared to share. "The kind that starts when you discover your commanding officers have been using your unit to eliminate inconvenient witnesses rather than enemy combatants." His expression darkened. "Military?" "Was. Special forces. We were supposed to be the good guys." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Turns out that designation is more flexible than they tell you in recruitment. You refuse to follow orders." "I refused to murder civilians who had witnessed things they weren't supposed to see." The words came out harder than she intended, carrying all the anger and betrayal that had driven her to flee. "Apparently, that made me a liability to national security." Damien leaned forward, his attention completely focused on her. "They're hunting you? We're hunting me." Past tense. As far as the world knows, Captain Serena Hayes died in a training accident 3 weeks ago. Convenient way to tie up loose ends. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see the truth of what she was telling him. "The woman who stumbled into your territory tonight doesn't officially exist. And unofficially, she's a ghost with combat training and a very inconvenient conscience." Serena finished the last of the stew, feeling strength beginning to return to her system. Not exactly the kind of guest most people want staying indefinitely. Most people, Damien said slowly, aren't alphas of supernatural packs living in territories that don't appear on any government maps. She studied his face, trying to read the thoughts behind those golden eyes. Are you offering me sanctuary? I'm offering you time to heal and figure out what comes next. His voice was carefully neutral, but something in his posture had shifted. Winter is coming to the mountains. No one travels these paths until spring, which gives you approximately 4 months to decide whether you want to keep running or find another solution. 4 months. The timeline felt both impossibly short and wonderfully long. Time enough to rest, to think, to figure out who Serena Hayes could become now that Captain Hayes was officially dead. But also time enough to complicate the already complex dynamic developing between her and the Alpha who had chosen to help rather than harm her. What's the catch? She asked, because in her experience, offers of sanctuary always came with prices that weren't immediately apparent. You contribute to the community. We're not a charity, and I won't support dead weight through the winter months. His tone was businesslike, but she caught the underlying challenge. You have medical training? Field medicine, trauma surgery, combat first aid? She rattled off her qualifications automatically. I can handle most emergency situations short of open heart surgery. Good. Our pack healer is getting old, and backup medical knowledge would be valuable. He stood, moving to add another log to the fire. You'll also help with general pack duties, hunting, food preparation, territory maintenance. Everyone contributes according to their abilities. And in spring, you leave. The finality in his voice was unmistakable. Shadowmere doesn't accept permanent human residence. It's a policy that has kept my pack safe for generations, and I won't change it for anyone. The dismissal stung more than it should have, considering she had known him for less than an hour. But something about the way he refused to meet her eyes when he delivered that ultimatum made her wonder if the policy was as unshakable as he claimed. Understood, she said quietly. 4 months of useful contribution in exchange for sanctuary, and the chance to disappear completely come spring. Exactly. He turned back toward her, his expression carefully controlled once again. There's a guest room upstairs. You'll find clean clothes and basic necessities. Tomorrow, I'll show you around the territory and introduce you to the pack members who live close enough to interact with regularly. Serena stood, testing her legs and finding them steadier than they had been in days. Damien. Yes? Thank you. For the food, for the sanctuary, for not asking questions I'm not ready to answer yet. She paused, studying his face in the firelight. I know kindness towards strangers doesn't come easily to someone in your position. Something flickered across his features, there and gone too quickly to interpret. Everyone deserves the chance to heal from whatever drove them to my forest, Serena, even if that healing has to happen within defined limits. As she climbed the stairs to the promised guest room, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that Damien Blackwood's carefully defined limits were about to be tested in ways neither of them could anticipate. The Alpha, who had sworn off emotional connections, had just invited a woman with secrets and military training into his home. And something about the way he had looked at her suggested that his legendary control might not be as unshakable as he believed. But what happened when winter ended and spring demanded she disappear from his life entirely? That question followed her into sleep, where dreams of golden eyes and dangerous promises kept her restless until dawn. The scent of pine needles and morning frost filled Serena's lungs as she stepped onto the cabin's front porch, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at Shadowmere, and her body had finally recovered from the brutal journey that had brought her here. The borrowed clothes, simple wool sweaters and sturdy pants that belonged to pack members, fit well enough, though she suspected Damien had been deliberately selective about which women had contributed to her temporary wardrobe. She found him near the woodshed, his axe cutting through logs with mechanical precision that spoke of both supernatural strength and deeply ingrained routine. Sweat gleamed on his forearms despite the morning chill, and Serena found herself momentarily distracted by the fluid grace of his movements. Even performing mundane tasks, Damien Blackwood commanded attention in ways that had nothing to do with his alpha status. "You're up early," he said, without looking in her direction, though she hadn't made any sound that human ears could have detected. "Military habits die hard," she replied, settling onto a nearby stump to watch him work. "Plus, I wanted to talk to you before the others arrive for today's patrol briefing." This earned her his full attention. He set down the axe and turned toward her, golden eyes alert and assessing. "Problem? Not exactly a problem. More like an opportunity that might solve several of your logistical issues." Serena pulled a folded paper from her pocket, sketches and notes covering both sides in her precise handwriting. "I've been observing your territory defenses, and there are some vulnerabilities that could be addressed without major resource expenditure." Damien's expression grew carefully neutral, the look he wore whenever pack business intersected with his growing awareness of her military expertise. "Such as? Your eastern border relies too heavily on natural barriers. The ravine is impressive, but it's not impossible for someone with the right equipment and motivation." She stood, moving to spread the paper on a nearby tree stump. "Here, here, and here. These are the most likely approach routes for anyone conducting surveillance or planning an incursion." He stepped closer to examine her sketches, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The proximity sent an unwelcome jolt through her system, one that had become increasingly difficult to ignore over the past week. Whatever was happening between them existed in the spaces between words, in the way his gaze lingered on her face during pack meetings, in the careful distance he maintained even as he sought out her company with increasing frequency. "You've been mapping our defenses," he said quietly, and there was something almost dangerous in his tone. "I've been identifying weaknesses that could get people killed," she corrected, meeting his gaze steadily. "It's what I was trained to do, Damien. You can either see it as a threat or as an asset." For a long moment, the air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with military strategy. Then he looked back down at her sketches, studying them with the focused attention of a leader who understood the value of tactical advantage. "What do you recommend?" "Motion sensors here and here, connected to a central monitoring system in your main lodge. Nothing fancy, solar-powered, weather-resistant, with range sufficient to give you advance warning of any approach." She pointed to specific locations on her rough map. "I can build them from components we can order through your supply runs to the nearest town." "You can build surveillance equipment?" There was genuine surprise in his voice. Special Forces training covered a lot of ground, including field expedient intelligence gathering. Serena allowed herself a small smile. "I may not be much use in a straight fight against supernatural strength, but I know how to even the odds through preparation and technology." Damien studied her for another long moment, and she had the distinct impression he was seeing her clearly for the first time since her arrival. Not just as a temporary refugee or a logistical challenge, but as someone whose skills could genuinely benefit his pack's security. "Draw up a complete proposal," he said finally. "Equipment list, installation timeline, maintenance requirements. We'll discuss it at tonight's leadership meeting." "We'll discuss it." The plural caught her attention. "You'll present your recommendations to the Pack Council. If they approve the expenditure and implementation, you'll oversee the project." His tone was businesslike, but something in his eyes suggested this was about more than just security improvements. "Consider it an extension of your contribution to Pack welfare." Before Serena could respond, The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of other pack members for the morning briefing. Marcus, Damien's second-in-command, emerged from the forest trail carrying a thermos that steamed in the cold air. He was followed by Helena, the pack's primary scout, and Jonas, whose massive frame and easy smile made him instantly likable despite his obviously formidable nature. "Morning, Alpha," Marcus said, his greeting including a respectful nod towards Serena. Human. The pack had taken to calling her simply human in the weeks since her arrival, not with any particular hostility, but as a clear delineation of her temporary status. Only Damien used her actual name, and only when they were alone together. The distinction was subtle but significant, another reminder that her place here existed entirely at his discretion. Marcus, Helena, Jonas. Damien's posture shifted subtly, becoming more formal as he assumed his alpha role. "What's the overnight report?" "Eastern border quiet," Helena reported, her sharp eyes moving between Damien and Serena with obvious curiosity. But there were unusual scents near the northern passage. Old, but not old enough to ignore. "Define unusual," Serena said before she could stop herself, then immediately looked to Damien for permission to participate in the briefing. He nodded slightly, and she felt a flutter of something that might have been pride at his implicit trust in her judgment. "Not pack," Helena continued, now addressing her answer to Serena as much as to Damien. "Not fully human either, something in between, like someone who spends time around our kind but isn't one of us." "Hunters?" Jonas suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't really believe it. "Hunters smell like gun oil and fear," Marcus said dismissively. This was something else, more sophisticated. Serena felt ice form in her stomach as possibilities began connecting in her mind. How sophisticated? Professional? Military, maybe? Helena's assessment sent alarm bells ringing through Serena's thoughts. Someone who knows how to mask their scent, but hasn't quite perfected the technique. The morning briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering patrol schedules, supply needs, and routine territory maintenance. But Serena's attention remained focused on Helena's report, turning over implications that grew more concerning with each passing moment. When the others finally dispersed to their various duties, she found herself alone with Damien again, the weight of unspoken concerns heavy between them. "You think they're connected to you?" he said quietly, reading her expression with unsettling accuracy. "I think someone has been watching your territory for longer than any of us realized," she replied carefully. "And I think my arrival here might have triggered increased interest from people who shouldn't know this place exists." Damien's eyes hardened, the warmth she had grown accustomed to seeing there, replaced by the cold calculation of an alpha protecting his pack. "Explain." Military intelligence has been aware of supernatural communities for decades, but there's always been an unofficial policy of non-interference as long as pack territories remained isolated and incidents were minimal. Serena chose her words carefully, knowing that what she revealed next could fundamentally change their relationship. "My unit was sometimes tasked with monitoring border regions, ensuring that supernatural activities didn't threaten civilian populations." The silence that followed was deafening. When Damien finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "You were spying on us." "I was gathering intelligence on potential threats to national security," she corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless in the face of his obvious fury. "But I never reported anything that would have endangered isolated communities like Shadowmere. Most of my reports emphasized the non-threatening nature of pack activities." "Most of your reports?" The question was sharp enough to cut. "There were incidents, rogue wolves, territorial disputes that spilled into human areas, situations that required official attention." Serena forced herself to maintain eye contact despite the growing storm in his golden gaze. "I always tried to minimize the scope of any intervention, But sometimes containment was necessary. Damien took a step back from her, and the physical distance felt like a chasm opening between them. How long? How long what? How long have you known what I am, what we are? His voice carried a note of betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound could have. Have you been studying us since the moment you arrived? Gathering intelligence for some future report you'll file when you disappear in spring? No! The word came out more forcefully than she intended. Damien, I told you, Captain Serena Hayes is dead. The woman who stumbled into your forest that night had already burned every bridge to her old life. I'm not here as a soldier or a spy. I'm here because you offered sanctuary to someone who had nowhere else to go. But you knew, he pressed, moving closer again, using his physical presence to intimidate in ways that reminded her he was far more than just an attractive man with leadership skills. You knew exactly what you were walking into that night. I suspected, she admitted, because lying to him now would destroy whatever trust had developed between them. The territorial markers, the isolation, the way you moved, it all fit patterns I had observed before, but suspecting and knowing are different things, and more importantly, it didn't matter. Didn't matter? His laugh held no humor. You walk into a supernatural predator's territory, armed with classified knowledge about pack behaviors and capabilities, and it doesn't matter. It didn't matter because I wasn't running to you, Serena said quietly. I was running from everything I used to be, including the part of me that would have seen you as a subject for observation rather than someone offering kindness to a stranger. The honesty in her voice seemed to penetrate his anger, and she watched as his rigid posture relaxed slightly. But the damage was done. The easy camaraderie they had developed over the past weeks now carried the weight of secrets revealed and trust examined. There's something else, she continued, knowing that partial honesty was worse than none at all. My commanding officer's interest in eliminating inconvenient witnesses wasn't limited to civilian contractors. There were pack members who had seen things they shouldn't have. Supernatural individuals who posed inconvenient questions about government activities in their territories. Damien went very still, the kind of supernatural stillness that preceded either flight or violence. And I'm telling you that my knowledge of those operations might be the only thing standing between Shadowmere and the kind of official attention that destroys communities like yours. Explain. The sense Helena detected, the professional surveillance techniques Marcus identified, they're consistent with a military intelligence operation designed to assess pack capabilities and vulnerabilities. Serena pulled out another folded paper, this one covered with organizational charts and operational timelines. Are you telling me that your unit was involved in murdering my people? I'm telling you that my refusal to participate in those murders is what made me a liability worth eliminating. The words came out steadier than she felt. If I'm right, someone in my old chain of command has decided that my death created an intelligence gap that needs to be filled. Damien studied her notes, his expression growing darker with each detail. You think they're planning an operation against Shadowmere? I think they're gathering information for an operation against several pack territories simultaneously, she corrected. Shadowmere would just be one target among many. But the intelligence gathered here could be used to develop tactics and strategies for use against other supernatural communities. And you know this how? Because it's exactly the kind of operation I would have planned if I was still wearing a uniform and following orders. The admission tasted bitter, but it was the truth. Systematic intelligence gathering, vulnerability assessment, development of containment or elimination protocols. Standard operating procedure for dealing with threats that can't be addressed through conventional diplomatic channels. Damien was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what she had revealed. When he finally looked at her again, his expression was unreadable. What do you want from me, Serena? I want you to let me help, she said simply. I know their methods, their capabilities, their likely timeline. More importantly, I know how to counter their surveillance and disrupt their intelligence gathering without triggering the kind of escalation that would bring the full weight of military intervention down on your pack. In exchange for what? In exchange for the chance to do something right for once, she replied, surprising herself with the raw honesty of the statement. I spent years following orders that I convinced myself served the greater good, only to discover that I was just another tool for people who saw supernatural communities as problems to be solved rather than societies to be respected. This is my chance to balance the scales. And when spring comes, the question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond tactical considerations. Over the past weeks, Serena had found herself thinking less about her eventual departure and more about the possibility of building something permanent here. Not just sanctuary, but belonging. Not just survival, but purpose. When spring comes, we reassess, she said carefully. Based on the threat level, the success of our countermeasures, and whether Shadowmere would benefit from having someone with my particular skill set as a permanent resident. Damien's eyes sharpened at the suggestion, and she could see him weighing her words against pack tradition and his own carefully maintained emotional barriers. The policy against permanent human residence wasn't just about security. It was about preventing the kind of entanglements that could compromise his leadership or create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The Pack Council will need to approve any significant changes to our security protocols, he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. And they'll need to understand exactly what kind of threat we're facing. Are you willing to trust me enough to let me present the full intelligence picture to them? Are you willing to trust me enough to accept their decision, whatever it might be? The question carried weight that had nothing to do with pack politics. This was about whether she was prepared to fully commit to becoming part of Shadowmere, not just as a temporary refugee, but as someone whose fate was tied to the community's survival. Yes, she said without hesitation, and felt something fundamental shift in the space between them. Damien nodded slowly, and when he looked at her now, she saw not just acceptance, but something that might have been respect. Tonight's meeting just became significantly more important than routine supply discussions. Damien. She caught his arm as he turned to leave, feeling the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. Thank you for listening, for trusting me enough to share this with the council, for not just throwing me out when you learned about my background. He covered her hand with his, and the simple contact sent electricity racing through her entire system. Thank you for telling me the truth, even when it would have been easier to keep hiding it. They stood like that for a moment, connected by touch and shared understanding, and Serena felt the fragile beginnings of something that went far beyond gratitude or tactical alliance. When he finally pulled away, she could see in his eyes that he felt it too. The dangerous pull of attraction complicated by trust, the possibility of something deeper than either of them had planned to find. But as they walked back toward the main lodge to prepare for the evening's crucial meeting, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that their developing connection was about to face its first real test. Because revealing her background was only the beginning. If the Pack Council approved her security recommendations, she would be asking them to trust her with the safety of their entire community. And if tonight's meeting went badly, she might find herself facing Spring's departure much sooner than expected, leaving behind not just sanctuary, but the first man who had made her wonder if love might be worth the risk of vulnerability after all. The Pack Council chamber fell silent as Serena finished her presentation, her detailed intelligence report spread across the ancient oak table like a battle plan. 7 pairs of eyes studied her with expressions ranging from grudging respect to outright suspicion, while Damien sat at the head of the table, his face an unreadable mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Elder Margaret, the Pack's oldest member and most influential voice after Damien, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. You're asking us to trust the word of a military spy who admits to conducting surveillance on supernatural communities for years. I'm asking you to trust the assessment of someone who knows exactly how these operations work because I used to plan them, Serena replied evenly, meeting the older woman's challenging gaze. Every detail I've shared tonight can be verified through your own observations. The question is whether you want to wait until they complete their intelligence gathering and move to the next phase. And what exactly is the next phase? Asked Thomas, the pack's head of security, his scarred hands drumming nervously against the table's surface. Serena exchanged a look with Damien, seeing permission in his slight nod. Containment or elimination, depending on the assessed threat level. If they determine that Shadowmere poses a significant risk to civilian populations or national security interests, they'll move to neutralize that threat through whatever means they deem necessary. Neutralize how? Margaret's voice was sharp with barely contained anger. Best case scenario, forced relocation to a government-monitored reservation. Worst case. Serena let the implication hang in the air, watching comprehension dawn on the faces around the table. The silence that followed was broken by Marcus, clearing his throat. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Based on the surveillance patterns Helena identified, I estimate they've been gathering intelligence for approximately 6 weeks. Standard protocol calls for 12 weeks of observation before moving to assessment and recommendation. That gives us roughly 6 weeks to disrupt their operation and convince them that Shadowmere isn't worth the resources required for intervention. And you believe your proposed countermeasures will accomplish this? Damien's voice was carefully neutral, but Serena caught the undercurrent of concern that only she seemed to recognize. I believe they'll create enough uncertainty and operational difficulty to make continued surveillance cost prohibitive, she corrected. Military intelligence operates on risk-benefit analysis. If we make gathering information about Shadowmere more trouble than it's worth, they'll shift their attention to easier targets. Elder James, who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, suddenly spoke up. There's another option we haven't discussed. All eyes turned toward the elderly man, whose weathered face carried the wisdom of 8 decades leading pack hunts and mediating territorial disputes. We could simply eliminate the surveillance team, he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of old-world justice. Remove the immediate threat and send a clear message that Shadowmere is not to be trifled with. That would trigger exactly the kind of escalation I'm trying to help you avoid, Serena said quickly, feeling ice form in her stomach at the suggestion. Kill a military intelligence team, and you'll have federal agencies descending on this territory with resources you can't possibly match. It would be the end of Shadowmere as an independent pack. She's right, Damien said, his authoritative tone brooking no argument. Violence should always be our last resort, not our first response to perceived threats. Margaret studied Serena with calculating eyes. You seem very confident about government responses for someone who claims to have abandoned that life entirely. I'm confident because I know exactly what protocols would be triggered by the death of a federal surveillance team, Serena replied. And I know that my former commanding officers would use such an incident as justification for operations they've wanted to conduct for years. The room fell silent again, as pack members processed the implications of her words. Finally, Thomas spoke up. What do you need from us to implement these countermeasures? Serena pulled out her detailed equipment list and timeline. Approximately $3,000 for components, 2 weeks for installation, and 4 pack members willing to learn basic monitoring and maintenance procedures. The system I'm proposing will give you early warning capabilities that exceed anything a human surveillance team can deploy. And in return? Margaret's question carried the sharpness of someone who understood that every alliance came with a price. In return, I'm asking for the chance to prove that a human can contribute meaningfully to pack security without compromising your independence or traditions. Serena's voice was steady, but she felt her heart racing as she prepared to make the request that would determine her future. "I'm asking to stay permanently as a full member of Shadowmere." The silence that followed was deafening. She could feel Damien's gaze burning into her, but she didn't dare look in his direction for fear of what she might see there. The request violated every precedent in pack history, challenged traditions that had kept Shadowmere safe for generations. "Absolutely not," Margaret said flatly. "Humans don't become pack members. It's not just tradition, it's biological reality. You can't shift, you can't participate in pack hunts, you can't contribute to the supernatural bonds that hold us together. But I can contribute skills and knowledge that no one else in this pack possesses," Serena countered, forcing herself to remain calm despite the dismissal. "Military training, tactical expertise, knowledge of government operations that threaten supernatural communities. These aren't abilities you can develop overnight. They're also not abilities we've needed for the past century of successful pack management," Thomas pointed out, though his tone was less hostile than Margaret's. "Because you've never faced the kind of systematic government attention that's becoming increasingly common," Serena replied. "Supernatural communities that refuse to adapt to changing threats don't survive long enough to regret their inflexibility." Elder James leaned back in his chair, studying her with ancient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of multiple pack alliances. "What you're proposing has never been attempted. The risks to pack cohesion, to our cultural identity, to the supernatural bonds that define us as wolves rather than simply as people, these aren't considerations we can dismiss lightly." "I understand the risks," Serena said quietly, "but I also understand the alternative. If you send me away in spring and another surveillance team shows up 6 months later, you'll face the same threats without any of the advantages my knowledge could provide." Damien finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of alpha authority. "The Council will discuss this matter privately and render a decision within 48 hours. Until then, Serena will continue her current duties while we evaluate both her proposal and her request for permanent residency." As the meeting broke up and pack members filed out of the chamber, Serena found herself alone with Damien, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. She had revealed everything, her background, her knowledge, her hopes for the future, and now faced the possibility that her honesty had cost her the only home she had found since fleeing her old life. "You didn't warn me you were going to ask for permanent residency," he said quietly, his back turned toward her as he gathered the scattered papers from the table. "I didn't know I was going to ask until the words came out," she admitted. "But sitting in that room, talking about Shadowmere's future, I realized that somewhere along the way, this stopped being temporary sanctuary and started being home." He turned to face her, and she saw something raw and vulnerable in his golden eyes. "You're asking me to overturn generations of pack law for someone I've known for less than 2 months. I'm asking you to consider whether those laws still serve the pack's best interests," she replied, stepping closer, despite the tension radiating from his frame. "And I'm asking you to consider whether what's developing between us is worth fighting for." The admission hung between them like a challenge, forcing them both to acknowledge the attraction that had been building since her first night in his cabin. Damien closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with surprising gentleness. "What's developing between us is exactly why this is so complicated," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I swore I would never let personal feelings compromise my leadership again. The last time I allowed my heart to override my judgment, it cost my mate her life. This is different," Serena whispered, covering his hands with hers. "I'm not asking you to choose between love and duty. I'm offering to help you protect everything you care about." For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. The air between them crackled with tension and possibility, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes with obvious effort. Then he stepped back, putting physical distance between them once again. "The Council's decision will determine what happens next," he said, his alpha mask sliding back into place. "Until then, we maintain appropriate boundaries." 3 days later, Serena woke to the sound of howling in the distance, not the joyful pack songs she had grown accustomed to hearing during evening hunts, but something urgent and alarming that sent adrenaline flooding through her system. She dressed quickly and ran toward the sound, finding pack members gathering near the eastern border with expressions of grim determination. Helena stood beside Damien, her usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "They moved in during the night," she reported tersely. "Full surveillance team, military-grade equipment, positioned for comprehensive monitoring of our daily activities." "How many?" Damien's voice was deadly quiet. "6 that I could identify, but there could be more." "They're not trying to hide anymore. This is preparation for the next phase of their operation." Serena felt her blood turn to ice as the implications hit her. "They're moving to active assessment. Something triggered an acceleration of their timeline." "Such as?" Marcus demanded. "Such as intelligence suggesting that Shadowmere poses a more significant threat than initially believed," she replied, her mind racing through possibilities. "Or such as orders from higher up the chain of command to expedite the operation for political reasons." Damien turned toward her, and she saw something like accusation in his eyes. "Could your presence here have triggered this acceleration?" The question hit her like a physical blow, because it was exactly what she had been fearing since Helena's report. "It's possible. If they identified me through surveillance footage or thermal imaging, if they connected my disappearance to this location, then bringing you here may have doomed us all," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp with anger. "Your presence didn't just risk exposure, it guaranteed it." "We don't know that," Damien said firmly, though Serena could see the doubt in his expression. "And speculation isn't going to solve our immediate problem. The immediate problem is that we have approximately 24 hours before they complete their assessment and transmit their findings," Serena said, forcing herself to focus on tactics rather than guilt. "After that, we'll be dealing with federal intervention rather than simple surveillance." "Then we eliminate the surveillance team," Elder James said grimly. "Remove the threat before it can escalate, and trigger the exact federal response I've been warning you about," Serena replied desperately. "There has to be another way." "There is," Damien said quietly, and something in his tone made her stomach clench with dread. "You leave tonight, disappear back into whatever wilderness you came from, and take their attention with you." The words hit her harder than any physical blow could have. After weeks of building trust, of finding belonging, of falling in love with both the pack and its alpha, she was being asked to sacrifice everything to protect the community she had come to call home. "If I leave now, it won't solve anything," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "They've already gathered intelligence on Shadowmere. My departure won't erase what they've learned. But it might convince them that the threat level is lower than assessed," Marcus pointed out. "A human refugee is less concerning than a military operative with pack protection." Serena looked around the circle of faces, seeing resignation and fear rather than the anger she had expected. These people weren't cruel. They were desperate, facing the potential destruction of everything they had built because they had chosen to help a stranger in need. "There's another option," she said quietly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "I could surrender myself to the surveillance team, claim I was held here against my will, and provide intelligence that portrays Shadowmere as a minor threat not worth federal resources." "Absolutely not," Damien's voice cracked like a whip. "I won't allow you to sacrifice yourself for this pack." "It's not sacrifice, it's strategy," she replied, meeting his furious gaze steadily. "I know exactly what kind of intelligence they need to justify de-escalation. I can give them a story that satisfies their superiors while protecting Shadowmere." "And then what?" he demanded. "You disappear into federal custody, face court-martial or worse for your desertion, and we never see you again. Then you survive, she said simply. The pact continues. Your daughter grows up safely, and none of this was for nothing. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Helena, speaking from her position as the Pact's primary scout and intelligence gatherer. There's a third option, she said quietly. We could give them exactly what they came here to find, but not what they expected to discover. All eyes turned toward her, and Serena felt a flicker of hope at the calculating expression on the scout's face. Explain, Damien commanded. They're looking for evidence of threat levels, supernatural capabilities, territorial range, and pack organization, Helena continued. What if we provided intelligence that was technically accurate but completely misleading about our actual strategic value? Understanding dawned in Serena's mind like sunrise after a long night. A disinformation campaign. Feed them real data that leads to false conclusions. Exactly. Show them a pact that's smaller, less organized, and more focused on survival than territorial expansion. Give them evidence of internal conflicts, resource limitations, and technological disadvantages that make federal intervention unnecessary. It was brilliant, Serena realized. Rather than hiding from surveillance or confronting it directly, they could use the government's own intelligence-gathering operation against itself. I could help design the disinformation strategy, she offered, excitement building as the possibilities became clear. I know exactly what kind of evidence would convince them to recommend minimal federal interest, and I could ensure that our daily activities support whatever narrative we want them to observe, Helena added. For the first time since the crisis began, Serena saw hope returning to Damien's expression, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of another pack member, Jonas, running toward them with obvious urgency. Alpha, he called breathlessly. We've got movement from the surveillance team, 3 vehicles heading directly toward the main lodge. The moment of hope shattered like glass. Whatever window they might have had for implementing a careful disinformation campaign had just closed. They're moving to direct contact, Serena said, her blood turning to ice. This isn't surveillance anymore. It's the beginning of an active operation. Damien's expression hardened into something that was pure alpha predator. Then we end this now, before it goes any further. Damien, no. Serena grabbed his arm as he turned toward the lodge. If you confront them directly, you'll be giving them exactly the evidence they need to justify federal intervention. And if I let them waltz into my territory and threaten my pack, I'll be failing in my duty as Alpha, he replied, though she could see the conflict in his eyes. Let me talk to them, she said desperately. Let me try to de-escalate this before it becomes something none of us can control. You're not going anywhere near that surveillance team, he said flatly. I won't risk your safety for tactical advantage. The admission revealed more about his feelings than hours of conversation could have, but there was no time to process the implications. The sound of vehicle engines was growing closer, and within minutes, representatives of her former life would be standing on Shadowmere territory, forcing her to choose between the woman she had been and the person she was trying to become. But as she looked into Damien's golden eyes, seeing determination and protectiveness and something deeper that neither of them had been willing to name, Serena realized that the choice had already been made weeks ago, during a conversation by a fireplace when a dangerous alpha had offered sanctuary to a stranger with nowhere else to go. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just her future, but the survival of the only family she had found since fleeing her old life. And she would be damned if she let anyone destroy the home she had fought so hard to find.